Welcome to the podcast. For anyone who's been following Elon Musk lately, you would have noticed that he has been someone who has been a proponent of people going back to work in the time of the COVID-19 crisis. He has been calling the mandated lockdowns as fascist, and Elon Musk has overall been completely against uh, the enforced lockdown during the COVID-19 situation. So, Elon came on the Joe Rogan podcast yesterday, and I think he had more time to speak in detail about his thoughts compared to his rants on Twitter. So, I have a few thoughts on Elon's take on the COVID-19 crisis and the entire lockdown situation in the United States. So it's just going to be me, and I don't expect this to go for more than a few minutes. And it's just going to be me trying to explain what Elon is thinking, and I will also give you my take on this entire situation at the end of all this. So, here we go. So, Elon's primary argument seems to be one of constitutional liberties. Right? He believes that the enforced lockdown is a violation of the freedom of choice granted by the American Constitution. But he also says that people should be free to choose what they want to do as long as they don't harm others. Right? So he clearly has room for that adjustment. When Joe points out that there is such a scope for harming others in COVID-19's case, Elon seems to imply that the mortality rate for COVID-19 is too low to deem such a drastic lockdown necessary. So Elon basically feels that the mortality rate of COVID-19 is too low for these constitutional liberties to be violated, really. In all fairness to him, Elon goes on to say that if we were to consider a future global pandemic with Ebola-like mortality rate, then this kind of an enforced lockdown would be justified. He also believes that the data is extremely inaccurate. So he talks about the number of COVID deaths reported in the United States, and he says that they are extremely inaccurate due to several reasons. The biggest one being that the COVID-19 stimulus check and support from the government for the hospitals are set up in a way that encourages hospitals to file deaths not caused by COVID-19 as COVID-19 deaths. He also states how a test is not necessary for a death to be classified as a COVID-19 death and just symptoms. So he worries about two things basically: that everyone who dies and had a cough or a fever is being classified as a COVID death, and that people who die due to totally unrelated reasons but have tested positive for the virus are being counted as COVID deaths. So his example was that of a man being tested positive for COVID and then gets run over by a bus. A hospital could technically classify that death as a COVID-19 death because he tested positive for COVID-19. He also does concede that this is quite a moral dilemma for the hospitals because he says that there's $8,000 for every COVID death and close to 30 grand for every ventilator that is used. And this can often be the difference between hospital staff getting furloughed or not. So to summarize, he thinks that the reported data on COVID-19 deaths are not accurate, and the mortality rate is very, very low compared to what was feared initially. He and Joe then talk about things like swimming pools and cigarettes that kill people all the time, but people have the freedom to choose to use it. But the bottom line really is that Elon thinks that the risk due to COVID-19 is not enough to deem infringement of the constitutional liberties worthy. So that's really Elon's take on the entire COVID-19 situation and the lockdown that has been imposed in several places in the United States. My take on all of this, so I'm as the ones who have been following my podcast would know, I'm fresh out of a conversation with two doctors on the COVID-19 crisis. So my take on this really is that, first of all, as an Indian, I really don't relate to the freedom above all mindset. It does seem to be an inherently American mindset. There have been several instances, even in my lifetime, where the Indian government have had to suspend the freedom of assembly, most recently in Kashmir before the COVID crisis. And as a citizen of a country of almost 1.5 billion people, I have gotten used to the fact that not everyone's freedom and public safety always go hand in hand. So, my take on the constitutional liberty side of thing and the freedom of choice really is that I am not in a position to comment on that because I really cannot relate to that. So, as Americans have, they've enjoyed this freedom and is really a part of their constitution, really. So this is really part of their lifestyle, and I do get where he's coming from, but I'm having a hard time actually relating to it. So, and as far as the incorrect data goes, on the incorrect death data and the low mortality rate, I think on some level Elon has a point. Right? The mortality rate has certainly been lower than expected, and I'll take his word on the death data, but someone will have to fact check that. But even if all of this is true and the mortality rate isn't as high as the initial prediction, the main concern with COVID-19, as the doctors I had a conversation with in my last podcast will attest to, is really the contagiousness of the virus. So at an R naught of 1.7, which is almost double that of the common flu, the number of infected people could go out of control really, really rapidly. And even if the virus is not as lethal as feared, it still is more deadly than the flu. And having millions and millions of people infected all at once does not seem to be a good idea to me. So now here's usually where someone would suggest what should be done next. But unfortunately, I'm not that guy because I honestly don't have a clue. Finding the balance between economic disaster and public health is an insanely hard job, and I have a lot of sympathy with the people who are tasked with making these calls. And on Joe's podcast, Elon spoke about several other interesting things, most of which I'm excited for and agree with. There was this one thing that I feel that might be worth flagging. So I'm gonna read out what Elon said on the podcast. So this is me quoting Elon. I do think that the globalization that we have at the meme sphere, there's not enough isolation between countries or regions. It's like if there's a mind virus, that mind virus can infect too much of the world. I actually sort of sympathize with the anti-globalization people. We need some kind of mind viral immunity. So he is talking about bad ideas that I think he uses the analogy of a mind virus, wherein in a global world, bad ideas could spread rapidly, or he thinks that bad ideas, once created in a certain region, in a global world, will infect the entire world. So I think he does get this completely wrong. So I feel like Elon makes a wide generalization based off of one scenario here. I think that the mind virus that he's referring to here is the idea that COVID-19 is a big deal, which I believe it is. And he thinks that this idea that COVID is a big deal got imported to the United States from overseas. So he thinks that anti-globalization would lead to regions being immune from such ideas. But so in essence, he thinks that in a non-global world, you would have, let's say, if Italy thought COVID-19 was a big deal, United States would be immune to that idea because they just don't believe it. But I think anti-globalization would just cause bad ideas to fester in isolated regions due to a lack of criticism from other countries and regions, really. For example, as an Indian, I can say with some degree of confidence that ideas like the caste system or arranged marriages are not going to get imported by the United States, right? And I believe that expecting an idea to be deemed valuable by the entire global community is the best method there is to validate its efficacy or value, really. And it has always worked. Like ideas like democracy, which is now anyone can say with confidence is a pretty global phenomenon where a huge chunk of the global population is democratic. So good ideas and ideas that are valuable are the only ones that really survive globalization, really. Ideas like I said, like the caste system in India, like arranged marriages, and it does work the other way around. Like, for example, things like political correctness and wokeness, I don't think are compatible with the Indian culture, and it's not politically valuable in India either. It's not going to win you votes. So clearly, the propagation of ideas in a global scenario is like a litmus test, really, and only the good ones can survive several countries. So I feel Elon gets that one wrong too. But to really summarize on the COVID situation, I think it's not all reckless as Elon's Twitter page kind of makes it out. I have always been critical of judging someone based on the few characters they can use on Twitter. And I feel the same way about Elon. I do think he has a point. I understand where he's coming from, but I wouldn't say I agree with everything that he's saying. But it certainly looks better than his Twitter page.